My name is Sharon Rounds, and I'm Associate Dean for Clinical Affairs at the Warren Alpert Medical School. On behalf of Jack Elias, Dean of Biology and Medicine, and Ashish Shah, Dean of the Brown School of Public Health, who are not able to be here today, I'd like to welcome you to the Paul Levinger Decoding Disparities seminar series. This series is a joint effort between the medical school and the School of Public Health that focuses on inequalities and health disparities that are experienced in healthcare today. Our goals for this lecture series have been to promote better understanding of where we need to make progress and what still needs to be learned as we work to close the gap on racial, economic, and social disparities of healthcare in America. Before going further, I'd like to acknowledge and thank those who made the series a reality, including a terrific planning committee from both the medical school and the School of Public Health. My colleague, David Williams, who is director of the Center for Health Equity Research and Health Promotion in the School of Public Health. And excuse me, the superstar team from a number of offices that has worked very hard to bring together a terrific lineup of scientific leaders on this topic. We're also fortunate that this series has been sponsored by the Paul Levinger Professorship in the Economics of Healthcare. This professorship was funded through an endowment established in 1987 to honor the memory of Paul Levinger. The gift was made by his wife, the late Ruth Levinger, their daughter, Betty Levinger Cohen, and her husband, Dr. John Cohen, a pediatrician from the Brown class of 1959. Now, I'd like to note some housekeeping. First of all, closed captioning is available for this seminar. The seminar will be recorded and will be available for viewing in the future on the Decoding Disparities website. And then finally, I'd ask the attendees to put your questions into the chat or Q&A functions, and we'll address those after the lecture is concluded. So now it's my great pleasure to invite Megan Ranney, who is director of the Brown Center for Digital Health, who will introduce our speaker from today.
Thank you, Dr. Rounds, and thank you for organizing this lecture series. I also want to give a big thank you to the entire lecture series planning committee, including Dr. Nicole Nugent, who is my associate director at the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health. So for those who aren't familiar with our center, the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health is a joint venture between the Lifespan Health System and Brown University to develop and disseminate effective digital health tools for patients and for populations. We're based primarily out of biomed, but have collaborators ranging from across all the hospital system, School of Public Health, School of Engineering, Computer Science, and beyond. And much of our work is really looking at how digital technologies can be used both to identify and intervene to reduce health risks, with the idea of health writ large. So not just about healthcare, but about the full picture of health. And with that in mind, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Desmond Patton, who I reached out to see if he could be our CDH designated speaker for this amazing series. Dr. Patton and I first met many years ago at University of Michigan, where he was a doctoral student or postdoc. And I
faculty.
You were a what? Sorry?
Faculty.
You were faculty. I'm so sorry. You were faculty already. And I was junior. I had just taken my faculty position. And we started to collaborate on uses of Twitter and how kind of Twitter is used to describe and incite violence. Over the last decade, since first meeting him, Dr. Patton's work has become cooler and more influential than it was when we first collaborated. He currently is at Columbia University, where he's not only an associate professor of social work, he's also associate dean of curriculum innovation and academic affairs, and he's the director of the Safe Lab, which is focused on the use of social media to try to inform discussions around violence and violence prevention. He's done some incredible work, including with Google and with Microsoft, has developed online tools for detecting aggression in social media posts, and is just an all-around impressive and cool person who consistently dedicates himself to both doing innovative but also influential work, and to moving the needle in a way that's focused both on great evidence generation and on paying attention to groups that sometimes get forgotten from the discussion. So I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Dr. Patton to give this last of the Decoding Disparities lectures. We're all going to learn a lot and hopefully come away inspired to do a little better in our own work. So Desmond, take it away.
Thank you so much, Megan, and hello to everyone. It's so good to be with you. A quick note, I haven't figured out how to have my notes in front of me, and so I have my computer to the right of me. So if I'm looking to the right, that's what I'm doing, but I am wholeheartedly engaged with our conversation for today. So I just wanted to start off with just more information about who I am, and I'm also going to share my screen so you can see this PowerPoint. For the last 8 years, I have studied the relationship between social media communication and gun violence, specifically in the city of Chicago. But I define myself as a digital qualitative researcher and a public interest technologist. And what this means for me is that I am particularly interested in the narratives that users write in digital spaces like social media, and how we build better ethical computational tools that leverage those stories to eradicate social inequality and promote good health and well-being. I'm also actively working to partner with youth and community members to develop contextually driven computational tools that use social media to prevent and intervene in the transmission of gun violence. My work is largely about meaning making and how we make meaning of text and images on social media. So it goes without saying that the major events of 2020 have reconfigured much of what I do. So racism and COVID-19 represent some of what researchers have been calling a pandemic on a pandemic, particularly for Black folks. The pandemics find themselves standardized to the detriment of Blacks and our health, as folks take to the streets to combat one or both issues: sanctioned surveillance, usually powered by facial recognition systems, or social media sentiment analysis, which all represent 21st century modes of policing of people of color who are suffering and fighting against the most painful health crisis of our time. What we have is a complicated digital narrative. On one hand, emerging technologies have afforded rapid testimony of lived experiences with COVID-19 and anti-Black racism that allow the larger collective to build communities of action, identify imperative resources, develop coalitions, and provide data for target actions and steps. On the other hand, those hyper-visible displays of Blacks and Latinos and other marginalized groups protesting becomes easily collected data for state-sanctioned violence. But the story is more complicated. Some cities have seen a surge in violence and crime during the pandemic. Some blame rioting that's planned on social media. Others blame a lack of policing as a result of protest cries for defunding the police. The issue of social media is prominent, particularly in the city of Chicago. The relatively new mayor developed a task force to develop plans to analyze social media data to prevent and intervene in community-based violence. But what we also know is that social media has illuminated the intersections of COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the criminal justice system. And on the one hand, as social media users spend more time on social media sharing the experiences of COVID-19 or organizing protests for Black Lives Matter, city governments like Chicago are also concerned about social media being weaponized against the city and its business owners. The Chicago Police Department has long monitored social media activity as a policing strategy, but will now be on the lookout for organizing or plans for looting that may be associated with protests. The mayor of Chicago has convened a task force to monitor social media activity for looting. However, these discussions lack a critical evaluation of the potential for misuses, misinterpretations, and an infringement on protected speech. So I am all too familiar with the complexity and challenges of analyzing social media. So let's take a look at this example. This is an example from a user, a young person from Chicago, a young Black youth. And this is an example of the type of tweet that would be a part of a social media corpus that I would analyze. And what's important about this tweet is that there are many different nuances here. I'm fitting to roll up J. Roy right now. Now, on the face, there will be a lot of questions about what does fitting to roll up mean and who is J. Roy, and our lack of contextual knowledge about what those actual words mean within that particular clause may deduce many interpretations that could be completely wrong. But when we invite other young people into the space where we diversify and include the voices of individuals from the same community to be a part of that interpretation process, we actually learn a lot more about what this tweet might mean. And so here, when we invited young people whom in our research we call domain experts to be a part of that interpretation process, we then learned that in some instances, when an example of this type is posted on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, that this means that someone is naming their weed or marijuana for an individual that has been murdered, typically someone that is from the opposing crew or gang or clique. And that particular interpretation is an important one because one might miss the potential volatility that might be associated with this type of post and how far reaching it would be and what it might mean for the community. So my introduction to the impact of social media on gun violence came by the way of Black Chicago youth who talked to me about a beef that was unfolding in Chicago in 2012. So I did my PhD at the University of Chicago. I came back to those young people to follow up with them about their lived experiences in Chicago around gun violence and educational experiences. I'm a now first year tenure track professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I'm back with those young guys, and they talked to me about a beef between two very well-known rappers who are from opposing gangs in Chicago. And what happened is that one of those individuals became very frustrated with the back and forth on Twitter. And so to kind of speed up the beef, he decided to post his exact location on Twitter and was like, if you want to do something about it, meet me in this location. And within 3 hours, that individual was murdered in the exact location that he tweeted online. And so I became really fascinated with the role of social media in that particular situation. Did it amplify the violence? Did it speed the violence up? Was social media a causal factor? Things like that. And as we've long known that Chicago has consistently struggled with issues of community-based gun violence for many years. And over the years, particularly in the last, I would say 5 to 10 years, the city has seen dramatic upticks in violence, upwards of classrooms of young Black and brown bodies being murdered each year. And so I became very fascinated by and saddened by the impact of this new emerging technology on the lives of young people. But at the same time, young people were also using social media more than ever, right? It's in particular young Black youth. And so we had these concurrent issues where there are more people online, more young people online, and they are expressing their lived experiences, which is oftentimes clouded by experiences with trauma and gun violence. And so we have the perfect storm of social media related gun violence. This work has been powered by my research lab, the SAFE Lab. We are a hodgepodge of folks from social workers, community members, undergraduate students at Columbia, formerly incarcerated citizens, computer scientists, communication research scholars, all trying to leverage social media as an ecological environment, a neighborhood, a community, to better understand the impact of technology on social media. And then we also know is that youth have fully embraced social media and often the family experts on how to use various platforms that are available to us. And so youth stated motivation for using social media is quite similar to traditional forms of communication, to stay in touch with friends, to make plans, to get to know people better and present oneself. And so what we know from Pew is that around 92% of youth are online. This is a few years old. 71% use more than one social media site. And of those teens that are on social media, 45% of Black teens at this particular time were using Twitter. And so I've always kind of consistently been interested in this role of technology in violence transmission. And so I wanted to learn more about this new phenomenon. And so I turned to the literature and essentially found that there was nothing there. And so I really wanted to have a conceptual understanding of the phenomena and to see to what extent the computer mediated communication literature had anything to offer, whether the sociological literature had anything to offer. And it became very clear that that was just not the case. And so in 2013, along with classmates from the University of Chicago, we wrote the first paper to define this new phenomena. Now, the title is Internet Banging, New Trends in Social Media, Gang Violence and Masculinity in Hip Hop. 8 years later, I'm not a fan of the term anymore. It was a play on words. It was a play on words for gang banging, but in our early definitions, we were so laser focused on communication from individuals that identify with being gang involved that we missed their humanity. We missed the ways in which other young people use social media that resembles a very challenging behaviors as well. And so it was a little too myopic in those early days, but it did allow us to really interrogate some of these new behaviors. And so I wanted to learn more. So we wrote this conceptual paper, and of course, I'm early in my tenure track, and I want to conduct rigorous research that allows us to really unpack this phenomenon. So the first thing I do is I go back to Chicago, and I connect with my colleagues and friends there. One of those colleagues and friends is Eddie Bocanegra, who you see, he has his foot on the chair, and Eddie has a very rich and interesting story. He himself was gang involved. He spent years in prison. And then came out, went to college, got his MSW at the University of Chicago, and has since been working in the gun violence area. At this time, he was the executive director of the violence prevention program at the YMCA in Chicago. And so he was my community investigator to help begin some interviews and focus groups with individuals that identified as being gang involved, either currently or formerly at that time. And we also interviewed outreach workers that were also providing support for these individuals onto the side of Eddie as well. We wanted to understand their ideas around social media and the impact that social media would have on the young people that they're trying to support. And so Eddie was my entry point into meeting young people and many of the reasons why I'm able to do this work today. And so I'm going to share a set of studies that we conducted. I'm going to talk about qualitative studies, more digital qualitative studies, and then the machine learning work as well. Some of our earlier work, we then conducted interviews with around 20 outreach workers. And I think that what was most compelling about these particular interviews is that we understood that outreach workers understood and knew the centrality of social media in the lives of young people. And they spoke very consistently about the impact or the way in which social media allowed young people to process things that are going on around them, to have an unadulterated space to speak in ways that they may not feel comfortable with other adults, and to access power, to have agency over their life where they can curate an identity, whether that identity is aspirational or true or fake, but it gave them power in a community in the world where they felt depowered. And I think that that particular nuance around their socialization in social media was important to understanding why a young person may post incriminating posts on social media without considering the consequences that are associated with that post. Then we also learned when we spent time with young people that it is extremely challenging to interpret social media posts and to get any level of ground truth. And so what we did in this particular study is that we went back to those young people and we asked them to look at a set of Twitter posts from individuals from their community. These are all publicly available tweets. And what was interesting in this particular study is that the participants were able to have a broad understanding of what was being communicated, but there was always differences in their interpretation based on location and based on proximity. And so if you were from the same block that other where the user was from, then you would have enough kind of cognitive calculus, if you will, to ascertain what was being communicated. But if you weren't from the same block, you may not understand the link between the institution and an emoji and the hashtag and text and images. And so it became very clear to us that this is not something that we can take lightly, that we can't just treat social media posts at face value, that there needs to be a deep contextualization of what's being said. And that was what we learned directly from young people. Then we started to look at interpreting posts on social media. And to do this, we started with a case. I met or learned about Jakira Barnes, in 2014 after her murder. Jakira Barnes was a 17-year-old young Black girl who was murdered just steps from her house in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. What was interesting, and I think why her story gained public news is that she was a young girl who was known as a shooter or hitter in her gang, which is a non-traditional role for a young girl. It's not uncommon for young girls to be a part of gangs, but to have this level of positionality was very unusual. And at the same time, she also had this mythology on Twitter, which people thought that she had killed or shot up to 17 to 20 people by the time she was 17 years old. And so I became particularly interested in her story because I wanted to know, because of her death, would her friends on Twitter be retaliating against whom they deemed to be oppositional to her in this post? And would studying her post provide us any information as to what aggression is, what it looks like online, what does threatening behavior look like online? And so, as you might imagine, we came across a number of posts that one might identify as being aggressive or threatening. And so things like Vernon, that's the gun line, you cross it, you end up with the headlines. These types of posts were quite common, but they're also common in the music that young people were listening to as well. And so being able to disaggregate, a lyric from an actual tweet was really difficult. And oftentimes the lines were so blurred that the meaning would be in the eyes of the beholder. But I also think that it's important to note that in those early days, our thinking around Jakira and her tweets was very much narrow, that I myself imbibed very complicated white supremacist ideals about young Black girls that it didn't occur to me that perhaps that this wasn't the starting point, that I wasn't asking the right questions of this data, that I had pigeonholed this young Black girl as violent, as bad, as negative, and I didn't see anything else. And so, of course, when we look at the data, we find tweets that are emblematic of violence and threats, and that becomes the narrative, the pathological narrative that is spun through social media about young Black girls. But what Jakira did in depth is that she forced me to see who she was, that over and over again, she provided these deeply hyper vulnerable posts about pain and trauma and the struggle day in and day out. I mean, this young girl had witnessed and seen and experienced more death than probably most of us will ever in a lifetime. And in conversations with her mom, she mentions to me that these traumas, these deaths fundamentally changed her daughter, that she no longer had a little girl, that she saw her face, her color completely change. And that became clearer, became into focus for me on social media as I allowed myself to see beyond the narratives that I had imbibed about her. And so she became the focal point of another set of studies where we dig deeper in the social media posts, one of the things that we were able to identify is that many of the posts that we saw from Jakira and individuals in her network were very similar to gang-like behavior that we would typically see in the community. Things like status seeking or retaliation were quite common and were labels and categories that we could easily find in Jakira's data and in her network data as well. But as I mentioned before, none of this work is actually possible without being able to really focus on context and interpretation and the power of those things to either do harm or to do good. If we get it wrong, it could lead towards another set of issues: policing, surveillance, mass incarceration. Um, and if we get it right, what does it mean to be identifying language of aggression and violence from young Black youth? Does being accurate actually lead to good well-being? And I think that becomes a really important question. But one of the ways in which we can really focus on this is through a contextual approach. We didn't have any methodologies or strategies for how to do this, and so we just made one up. We created the contextual analysis for social media approach, or the CHASM approach, to really center the voices of young people and to center context in our approach. So here's an example of a type of post and the type of analysis that we would do. Jay Smoker thinking about D-Money. Here we want to focus on nouns, on verbs. We want to be able to understand the link between the words and emojis as well. Again, it's really important that we understand that in this particular example, Jay Smoker thinking about D-Money is another example of naming someone, naming weed after someone that has been murdered. And that if you don't understand that, then you would miss that this post is about grief and about aggression. And that becomes an important point for outreach workers who may be trying to prevent a violent act outside of social media. As I mentioned before, critical to this work is our domain experts. And so we would hire young people as research assistants from Chicago to be a part of our lab. They spent a year with us working to help us translate and interpret those posts. We partnered with the YMCA to identify these individuals, but we made a lot of mistakes in the past because although we have learned so much from these domain experts, what we missed is that they had their own lives and that oftentimes their lives did not match up with my expectations as this, academic, and that we really had to redirect how we support these young people in that process. And so while they have provided extremely important work, we had to reframe and retrain ourselves to be able to better support these young domain experts in their own development as technologists as well. And then we also hire MSW students to help look for themes in those social media posts. And they oftentimes will partner with our domain experts when we're looking at the data. And then we would study the agreement between how a social work student would look at a post and how a domain expert will look at the post as well. So let's apply CHASM. This is an annotation system that we created. It's called the Visual Textual Analysis System, or VATAS. And this is where we store all of our data. And this is the system that our annotators, our social work students use, or domain experts use when looking at data. I'm going to walk you through the process of using CHASM to look at data. So for example, this is a post that we would get. I've been up for like 3 days straight. We want to get the first impression from an annotator on how they're thinking about this particular post. And so the first impression, the baseline, is not helpful at all. He hasn't slept in days, right? And so we don't really understand, it doesn't give us any clarity on the post. And that's something that we all could have ascertained by looking at it. But with CHASM, we asked the annotator to then focus on context. So we asked them to go back to the original social media post. We give them web-based resources like Hip Hop Wiki to make sure that they understand terms and words that are being used. We go back to the post. They look at the peer network, right? Because oftentimes an individual, not oftentimes, but at times a young person may claim to be gang involved, but you look at their network on a particular social media site and they're following Disney characters. So there's some incongruity with who they present in the network that they're actually a part of. Offline events, things happening in society, things happening in the community, things happening at home, really dictate how we should interpret those posts. And so if you're not contextualizing words vis-a-vis events that are happening around a user, then you might miss critical interpretations. We look at virality and how far reaching that post is going and who's engaging with that post. Now the annotator is going through all of that contextual analysis, centering these ideas, and they have a lot more to say. So now the annotator says, well, this user is saying he's been up for 3 days straight, most likely meaning he hasn't slept in 3 days. The post comes days after his friend was killed. This user may be having difficulty sleeping because of his friend's death. He includes a persevering emoji and a flesh face emoji. Now we understand that there is a sleeping component and there's a grief component that are all extremely important to how we label what this post is. So on the face, we could have labeled it one thing, but now we have much more information and context to be able to provide a more robust label, an informed label for machine learning analysis. Here's an example of the codes that we would have for our code book when labeling and annotating our social media data. The most complicated part of being a social worker that is working with computer scientists is this need for binary classification, to sort of pack everything into these nice little boxes, and that becomes really challenging. So as you see, our 2 predominant labels were loss and aggression. We identified those labels through qualitative analysis, and then everything else was captured as other. This is the first step. This is not the only process, but this is where we began in our process. And so everything was coded loss, aggression, or other. Our goal is always to get this data labeled and to hand it off to our computer science friends. But before we do that, we go through another set of validation and reconciliation as well. Number 1 is issue of consent. So many of you may be wondering to yourself, well, did he get consent to look at social media posts and to make these types of interpretations? No. We got all of our data from publicly available Twitter posts, and we went through an IRB process, and it kind of flew through the IRB process. We didn't have to have consent to ascertain publicly available data, but what we did, because we did not feel comfortable with that, is that we did a couple of things. We really tried to get consent, and so we would DM young people, we would write to them, we would try as much as possible to get them to give us consent to look at their posts, but to no avail. And so what we did is we would go back to the communities where the social media posts were derived. And so we would go to churches, outreach organizations, violence prevention organizations. We would talk to the community, staff members and young people about what we were doing, about the processes that we were engaged in, and make meaning of some of those posts and to get their impressions of what we're doing in order to get a community level agreement about the type of work that we're doing. And then we would also study disagreement, because there would be a lot of differences between how our social work students would look at data and how our domain experts would look at data, because the domain experts would have a very different understanding of things like place and context, and they would have a backstory around a post that we just would not have, and that would radically change how they interpret it, or would change their particular process for interpreting posts as well. And so we would just study that disagreement as well and add that as an additional data point for our labeling process. And then again, we would hand off all of our data to our colleagues. We work with 2 colleagues in particular, Kathy McEwen and Shifu Chang. Kathy McEwen is a natural language processing expert and an expert in text summarization, and Shifu Chang is an expert in computer vision. And so the objective with partnering with computer scientists is to develop an AI system to automatically detect aggression and loss in social media posts from gang-involved youth. We employ a number of techniques: supervised learning, including natural language processing, looking particularly at discrete pictures that are extracted from that text on social media, and then labeled with aggression, loss, and other labels. And then using semi-supervised learning or neural nets, particularly focused on word embeddings and adding a much larger unlabeled data corpus to our work to be able to automatically identify labels and categories. And so we started off small, because what we learned very soon in this process is that all the gold standard machine learning, artificial intelligence tools failed at being able to interpret the language of young Black youth from Chicago, consistently got it wrong. And so what we started off with was a thick data approach by looking at just a very, very small group of social media posts from Jakira and users in her network. And then we had to create our own ontology or dictionary and hand label parts of speech tags on those social media posts, because none of the tools would work. When we did that, this work is published in this Colon paper from 2016. Our measure of accuracy was relatively low for a machine learning algorithmic process. And so we were around the 60th 62% in terms of an F measure, which meant that we were getting the correct label right for aggression and loss right automatically 62% of the time. And so as you might imagine, that is not a great accuracy score. But again, it is an important kind of conversation around what does accuracy mean within the context of Black youth and violence? Will we ever have an accurate tool? Will it ever be 100%? And does adding additional label data actually help? But in this process, as we're looking at the data to see if we're missing anything or if there are any patterns that perhaps may explain why our accuracy is so low, we found a particular phenomenon that we thought was really important. And there's this idea that, number one, grief and aggression were not random in our data sets, and that expressions of grief actually preceded expressions of aggression, and there would normally be a 2-day window. And this was a game-changing finding for us because I don't think that we considered the role of grief expressions and the processing of grief of young people as a first step. And I think it changed how we thought about young people. It changed how we thought about their behavior. And this is all because of some of the failures in our process that forced us to look for different variables and different connections and narratives that are oftentimes overlooked, particularly when talking about young Black youth. And so at this point, then we wanted to add more data. We wanted to increase our data set. And so what we did is we employed a snowball technique to identify more individuals in Jakira's network. And so we wanted to identify people that she had the most mentions and replies with. And that allowed us to identify a core group of a little under 300 individuals and to create a corpus of social media posts that was approximately a little over 1 million Twitter posts to be able to look at these associations in a more robust way. This paper is published in EMNLP in 2018, Detecting Game Vault Escalation. So if you want to learn more about that here, but in this particular paper, what was important is that we added more context, we had more data, and the F measure increased. So we were able to deploy neural nets in this approach, which also doubled our data as well. But again, we're getting closer and closer to higher levels of accuracy. But is that where we need to be? And that's always the constant question in our work. And then we wanted to look at images because images are important to helping us to interpret different dynamics that are unfolding on social media and also have an interesting relationship between text and images. So in this particular set of studies, we wanted to understand, does images help us understand grief? Does images help us understand aggression? And we also added the contextual variable of the psychosocial variable of substance use as well. What we learned in this particular study is that text is better for interpreting grief because it's more expressive with language. Images were better. It was easier to automatically identify images that are emblematic of aggression because things like guns were very prominent in our data set, and they would be tagged as being aggressive because the gun was there. But again, like needing to interrogate this because does having a gun, should that be equated to mean to a meaning of aggression, something we're constantly asking ourselves. And then text and image were equally useful for substance use. Here's an example of the types of things that we would identify in our data set. These are not images for our data set. These are stock images from Google, but we wanted to show you an example of the types of things that we would find and how we would label them and the bounding boxes that would be deployed to be able to automatically find these psychosocial codes in our data set. Right, so ethics, let's talk about ethics because I imagine that many of you are like, is this Big Brother? Is this helpful? What are the ethics for doing this work? And I think, this is a very complicated piece for me, and it is the very thing that keeps me up at night. Because on one hand, we have a situation where we know that young Black and Brown kids may die based on what they say online, that it is something that happens, and that there is concern from moms and dads and siblings and family members who just want any tool that can help keep their kids safe and bring their kids home at night. Now, on the other end, those same tools, artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer vision tools can be used, overused, in answering the wrong questions that then lead to a dragnet approach to surveilling Black and brown bodies and creating new tools and pipelines for mass incarceration based on interpretations that are weak or shouldn't be valid in the first place. And so we engage in a number of practices to really try to overcome this, but I never feel quite complete here. Number one, we're very careful about how we store our data, who sees our data. We make sure that everyone that is a part of this analysis process has agreed to a set of terms that keeps the data safe as possible in all of our presentations. And unless we're talking about Jakira because her story was so public and her Twitter account was made so public, anyone else, we do not share, their user handles or any information that could be publicly available there. We don't share any images from our data set. We do not partner with the police. We've never partnered with the police. It is a question whether or not we should, but the police are engaged in their own set of surveillance practices and policies that are complicated. And so we have not engaged in that process. And then we ask anyone who might be interested in looking at our data, analyzing our data, to agree to a set of use cases or ideas that they will follow to protect the data as well. But this is the very thing, again, that keeps me up at night. I've been having a lot of conversations with Jakira Barnes' mother. And what's been really interesting about those conversations is that she's actually very supportive of the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And she thinks that it could have saved her daughter. And she thinks that it can save the lives of other children that were in her daughter's life as well. And for her, it's about, keeping her child safe and keeping other children safe. And so I think that this level of ethics discussions oftentimes missing. We don't have the real use cases that really challenge how we think about what ethics are in this space. And so the goal of all of the work has been to really support social workers and outreach workers and any kind of practitioner that might be interested in trying to support young people by leveraging what we know online. But as I mentioned before, we have some severe inequality issues with the deployment and integration of these tools where we normally only deploy them on communities of color and not universally. We've seen this example of this issue, particularly as it relates to these young Black men on my left that were arrested in Harlem based on the gang takedown, where these young men were surveilled for years and years and months based on images that they were a part of on Facebook, where we have two white men that were a part of mass murders who left racist manifestos and were not surveilled or in the same ways. And so I think in order to put this work into action, when I'm closing up very soon, in order to put this work in action, we've engaged in several kind of youth building, youth technology labs to really bring in youth voices and to have a more inclusive technology space that anticipates issues of ethics and really centers their knowledge as a part of ethical AI creation as well. So we have a youth lab out of Brownsville where we work with these amazing young people to develop clinical simulations to help young people think about their digital footprint, but to also push back against adult stakeholders that might be using social media to surveil Black communities. And so they created the Blue Room, which is a Facebook-like simulation. It is a game that young people can play, and it gives them different examples of altercations and other issues that might unfold on Facebook or Instagram, and allows young people to pause, take a moment and think about what they're doing, how they're responding, and it gives them different scenarios to play around with in a game-based space. We also, we partner with MIT, the Teaching Systems Lab at MIT, to create a practice space for educators, for judges and attorneys, for police officers that might be using social media to make decisions. This space allows that particular user to practice interpreting different social media posts, not necessarily with the goal of becoming a better interpreter, but really asking themselves, am I the right person to make these decisions? Do I have enough context to make these decisions? And what might be a different approach to how I may use this data in my work? Hopefully leaning towards less punitive strategies of using social media that oftentimes is only used for negative character testimony as well. So what are some key takeaways from this work? I think that social media should be deemed as an ecological environment, a neighborhood, and a community. It's a place where youth live. It is not this thing that young people do, but it is a part of their everyday life. And it can be a tool for understanding violence. I think the AI can offer opportunities to augment some of our prevention efforts for those of us that are engaged in community-based violence work. However, I don't think that AI or social media are the sole answers to violence prevention. And when not used thoughtfully or correctly, they are used as tools for surveillance and mass incarceration. And that is the exact thing that we do not want to happen. I think that context is extremely important when interpreting these posts, and it's important when using it for any type of violence prevention efforts. It is also important at the same time we're having difficult conversations about our own biases, whether they're personal, institutional, or both at the same time, because these biases, these issues of white supremacy and racial bias have adverse effects when they're not recognized and challenged in our interpretation process of social media and how we integrate these new tools and how we leverage them for change. And then lastly, this work should never be done alone, that we should be engaged in interdisciplinary work so that we are bringing in critical and diverse perspectives when I'm thinking about the application of social media and AI for community violence prevention. I come back to this last picture. This is a picture of Jakira at her graduation from 8th grade from the Illinois Institute of Technology's Math and Science Academy, because what Jakira did in death was that she forced me to reckon with her humanity. She forced me to see her for who she was. She forced me to wrestle with the complexity of her life and the nuances of her life in ways that we did not do. And I believe that the story that she left behind is one that we need to really understand in terms of our work with youth and the use of social media, in terms of being able to challenge any kind of misconceptions or interpretations that we may have of young people that do not focus them as humans. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Desmond. This was terrific as always.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Bravo. So some questions. Megan wants to know about other social media platforms. Have you worked with those?
Yeah, so we haven't done a lot of work outside of Twitter, but we have definitely done some more qualitative and contextual-based work of Facebook and Instagram posts. What's important to note is that what we know is that not a lot of young Black people are on Twitter anymore. This is work from a few years ago. We're seeing a lot more engagement on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook. But it is more challenging to collect that data from those companies. And so one of the things that we do is that we may engage in some retroactive interviews where we have people come into the lab and bring in illustrative examples of interactions or engagements on those platforms so that we can have them engage in an interpretive process to understand what's happening in those spaces.
So I have a naive question. Has similar type of analysis been done for comparison groups of other young people, such as, for example, Twitter in a suburban high school, wealthy suburban high school? Do they use similar language and memes and expressions?
That's a really good question. I cannot name another study that has essentially looked at white students in the same way. I have a number of colleagues that have looked at expressions of mental health disorders among white presenting individuals within a hospital setting that are happening in Boston and in Chicago, but they have not looked at or even asked questions around issues of aggression or loss and grief in the same manner. And so the context of these studies has been quite different. The questions that we ask of those studies have been quite different.
What about nationalistic militant groups who also might use this Twitter platform a lot?
Yeah, there are a number of individuals that are studying online harassment from more radicalized groups. And I haven't, spent a lot of time in that space, but when I have had those discussions within the context of social media companies, some of the biggest challenges have been, do we treat these groups in the same manner? So do we treat gang-involved youth in the same way in which we treat radicalized groups? And I think some of the major distinctions have been in terms of the types of communication, whereas young people who may be gang-involved are expressing everyday lived experiences, where individuals in radicalized groups are oftentimes expressing propaganda that has been fed to them.
Um, here's an interesting question. Is anyone applying a similar analysis to a certain president's tweets?
I don't know if it's a similar analysis, but so many people have been studying those tweets for the last 3.5 years. And I think that we'll have some interesting papers coming out really, really soon.
Okay, well, that'll be fascinating. What proportion of the tweets that you have studied amongst the youth of Chicago reflect grief and or aggression? I mean, I guess the question relates to proportionality. I mean, it's a communication pathway. So how much of it relates to those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say only 4 to 5% of our data has been categorized as being aggressive, whereas or being an expression of aggression, whereas I would say 50 to 60% of the data has been labeled as being an expression of grief or loss. And
Wow.
so it is a function of the context, right? And that I think it's been important to note that oftentimes mostly young people are not coming online to be aggressive, right? And that is not the predominant use, that is not the thing that they want to engage in, or why they're using the platforms. But I think what social media does for a lot of us is it is a place where we can express what is going on in our life. And if your life is consumed with violence or with pain or trauma, that is one of the things that young people may talk about online. So we see a lot more of that kind of complicated expression of like grief and loss than we see of actual posts that might be interpreted by other young people as being aggressive.
And how old are these young people what's the age range?
Yeah, so it's hard to determine age. So we have to be really tricky with how we determine age. Young people may mention their age online. They may provide their age or their birthday in their biographical description. So we don't really know, because people can curate whatever identity they want to online. But I would say the general age has been between 14 to 25 years old.
And what accounts for the drop off after age 25?
Well, it's not necessarily a drop off. That is what we have been focused on in terms of interest. And so we really have been interested in a particular category of young people that are most likely to either be exposed to community-based violence or participants of community-based violence. But I don't think that it's not necessarily true that behaviors change as individuals get older.
Okay. And let's see. Have you seen any data suggesting that certain types of replies to tweets about grief can be helpful?
That's a really good question. No, I've not seen that data, but that is actually outlining my next study. So I have an NSF study under review now to look at this very issue, because what's been interesting that I didn't mention is that we have turned our attention to focusing on grief and loss, because I think that grief and loss is a better indicator of later posts that could be troubling. And if we focus on helping young people process trauma and grief, that I think that could be more helpful. And so that's exactly one of the features that we want to focus on.
Well, good luck with your reviews. It
Thank
sounds
you.
like an important study to do. Okay, well, so this has been terrific. We thank you very, very much for taking the time to visit us virtually here at Brown. And on behalf of the entire group, I just want to say a few words. This, as Megan mentioned earlier, this is the last of this series. It's been a terrific learning experience. We've gone from climate change to Twitter posts, and it's been really a wide-ranging group of talks that we've all learned a great deal from. And Dr. Patton, thank you once again for being our speaker today. It's been a great learning experience. So, and thanks to everybody, all the participants, for your interest and attendance. It's been fun working with the group, the whole group. See you later.
Thank you.
Happy holidays. Stay safe, everybody. Most importantly.